This is Streets and People, conversations about people and projects shaping how we move. Find us at getaroundcaboolture.au. Today we're doing one of our People and Projects episodes, and I'm here in the studio with Jonathan Bray, who I wanted to invite onto the show because he talks about suburban transport, and he's one of the few people who talks about suburban transport. So I was like, okay, here we are in the outer suburbs. This is a really important topic and close to our hearts. I'm here on Gubbi Gubbi country in Queensland in Caboolture. And Jonathan, whereabouts are you?
Well, I'm usually in England, but at the moment I'm in Estonia.
What made you interested in suburban transport, and why are you still interested in that today? Or is that maybe even not necessarily a particularly interesting part of your work?
I'm freelance these days. My background's decades in making the case for progressive change on transport policy and campaigns. I was involved heavily in the anti-roads campaign in the UK, which was pretty successful back in the 90s. And my last big job was coordinating the network of transport authorities in the UK. So Transport for London, Transport for Greater Manchester, all the big transport authorities. Decided I didn't want to work full time and just do things policy-wise that interested me. And I guess I've always been interested in the stuff that no one else is doing. I'm always a bit restless for what is the next horizon. And suburbs, it seems to me that you could have a pile of reports about cities a mile high, but if you stacked up the reports about suburbs, you might get to a foot. But most people live in suburbs. They don't live in big cities, in the centre of cities. They live in suburbs. If we're going to tackle transport problems more widely, we need to do the tough stuff as well, which includes suburbs. So that was my impetus to do it. In the UK, the Foundation for Integrated Transport, and they gave me a year's fellowship, which enabled me to travel around and see stuff that was good and interesting and some thinking time. So it was a really enjoyable process that I was lucky enough to undertake, and completed the project and did this report.
So that was one called Decarbonising Suburban Transport, Ways of Thinking and Acting. And the other one, which is more recent, which is This is the Sound of the Suburbs. We'll put the link in the show notes, but just in case somebody doesn't get around to reading those, or maybe can't read, step me through what those articles are about.
The Sound of the Suburbs is a summary article really from the report. What I tried to do with the report is do it slightly differently, because I know, particularly these days, how many people read all the reports they've probably got stacked up that they know they should do. So there's various summaries, and also there's a playlist. I like to think it's the first transport report in world history to have its own playlist, because there's lots of good tunes about suburbs. The report, it doesn't have one single here's what you should all do message, because I think one of the messages of the report is you need to think about it. Because one of the things that struck me in particular when I went to some of the next level, as I described them, European cities, I thought they're probably all going to be doing similar things, but not really. They're doing slightly different things because they've taken time to think about it. They've looked at what their starting point is, and they've worked out from there, and they've thought quite hard about where they want to be as places and what's going to work, in particular in their areas. So you can look at some places that have gone big on car sharing, like Bremen in Germany, go to Berlin, where they've gone mega on mobility hubs, as well as street trees. Just passed a new law there, which mandates 1 million healthy street trees in Berlin. So different approaches, and it comes from, where do we start from? Let's take the thinking time and let's come up with solutions that we think could work in our area. And also what they're pretty good at is trialling things at reasonable scale. One of the problems in England is when we pilot stuff, we often pilot it at such a tiny scale that it doesn't really tell you what would happen if you did it at a very big scale. They tend to be better at doing pilots at meaningful scale to see what works, and then if it does work, they'll go really big on it.
That's very interesting, because obviously we do small trials here. It's got the same Anglo kind of way of thinking. One colleague who's North American, Professor Peter Norton, he said it's to do with the fact that we have a common law legal system, whereas in other countries they don't have that. And so I'm wondering if that's part of the legal infrastructure that allows more flexibility.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that at all. Yeah, one of the things that came through was a different attitude as well. What I described it as a civic imperative. It's really interesting you say that because one of the things that strikes me is we tend to be quite absolutist about things. And I'm talking from an English perspective. I can't claim to know the Australian scene anywhere near as well. So we're going to do this because it will create 10,452 jobs, or we've got to do this because it will save the planet. Whereas the mainland European attitude tends to be, how can we make our city a better place for our citizens? It's idealistic, but it's kind of less absolutist. And everything they do is not world changing in itself. They reckon it contributes to the bigger picture. And I think the other thing, I think, certainly in England, is I think transport planning, and it's a kind of a military logistics. It's very hard. Engineers, finance people, all the hard skills around the table, the soft skills are not around the table. And it's all about rules, following rules. Whereas when you go to places like the Netherlands, I'll give you an example, rubbish bins. So in England, we design streets so it can enable the largest bin lorry to get down that suburban street. So you have big turning circles, wide roads. And also the bins have to be as near as possible to the bin lorries as they can. So you get these ugly bins on the pavement. And that's because the sanitation department, that's what they want and that they get because everyone's got their rules. I can't imagine that happens in the Netherlands, where the bins go underground, the collective bins, and the rubbish is stored underground. It looks better, it works, because it's the obvious thing to do. I hadn't thought of a legalistic aspect, but I do think there is something going on around the culture which makes it harder for us to achieve what we see when we go to mainland Europe.
I was on a webinar the other day and it was from Perth in Western Australia. And they have a lot of Brits in Perth. And I asked, are you able to get the road narrowing through and the bike lanes because it has a higher British population? And essentially they said yes, because we're more used to having smaller vehicles in the UK. We're also more used to having narrower street widths. Whereas on the East Coast, where we are, it's very wide roads. And in fact, Brisbane is designed to have, in Paris, you have the boulevards, which were put in by Haussmann. It was a military intervention so that if there were the rabble rousers, you could send the military down there. And that's why Brisbane has much wider streets than anywhere else in Australia. So we have really wide ones. And so it's very hard for people to think that it's small. So everybody has this idea, but we've got these large distances. And I think it's just to do with the road width. And I'm just wondering, since you do travel a lot, about the cultural differences and what we can learn, what can we take on board that from Europe, from Britain, that will make our places better and less car dependent, that would still work in the cultural context that we have.
Yeah, I was thinking about that when I was doing the concluding bits of the Suburbs report because I don't think it's realistic to expect a whole cultural, political, social history to just change to someone else's because of transport planning. But could you infiltrate some of that kind of thinking in particular ways, or could officers start to do that? Because again, I don't know what local government culture is like in Australia, but certainly in England, it can be a bit rigid and a bit rule based and engineer based. Is there ways in which that can start to break down in particular areas? For example, around this kind of wider civic approach rather than, because in England it's about we're doing this for economic growth or we're doing this for the environment. Can we start to go, let's do things that are good for the citizens of the city and build that kind of different approach I was talking about? Can we just start to infiltrate that in particular areas? And that may be a way forward rather than expecting wholesale change in culture. I'll give you another example from France, which I thought was interesting. In England, and I've been part of it, and it's legitimate, you're either against the car or you're for the car. There's no middle ground. Anything that the Green side does that is around increasing car occupancy or something like that is very suspect, like treacherous. Whereas the French don't really seem to have that, and they've got this phrase which I really liked, which was doing the car differently. So accepting that the car's not going to go away, particularly in suburban areas, and also that you need good public transport and good active travel. But beyond that, how can you do the car differently? Sharing of cars is absolutely massive in France now and getting bigger. They're also doing a lot of innovative stuff. For example, I was in Grenoble and they've got car share now as the equivalent of a bus route, not instead of. There is public transport services on these corridors, but what they do there is that you can go on an app. It's fixed stop. The drivers sign up to be part of it, like a lot of these apps. They get 50 cents for every empty seat for nothing, even if no one uses car shares. And if someone car shares, they get €2 per passenger, and the car share users can use it for free. And it's also doing that in Paris as well. And I thought that was really interesting. I'm not saying that this is the answer to everything and this should be done in other cities. I'm saying it's interesting, the different mindset. I don't know what the economics are. They say it's pretty successful, but it just shows that they don't see this as an act of treachery, and they don't see it as they've reinvented the wheel. They just see we've got all these cars with one person in going on this core commuter routes. We could put more buses on, or we could give this a go and make more use of the vehicles that are already going up and down. So it just shows that kind of different attitude again than certainly we get in England.
Obviously, here in the outer suburbs, you have some people who do these very long commutes. It's actually a very small proportion of the number of people who are traveling in a day here. I think it's, I don't know, maybe a quarter or a third of people who are driving in a day. Most people just stick to the school, the hospital, the shops. It's very local. And so, an app like that, how could that work in an outer suburban area where people aren't doing the commute? Because the commute's relatively easy, high volume, pretty direct. That's not complicated. It's really the suburbs and the outer suburbs which is tough, and it's really hard. What have you seen from other places that is interesting or unusual?
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying. And I think one of the things is people tend to have this idea that the suburbs are just dormitories and the only travel flows in and out of the main city. And as you say, the stats don't back that up. I don't know what it's like in Australia, but commuting isn't even the main trip purpose anymore in England. Shopping is bigger. And the third biggest trip purpose is just going for a walk. One of the things I think is where light mobility may come in, and light mobility is one way of describing all the kind of below car ways of getting about: bicycles, e-bikes, e-scooters, microcars and what have you. A lot of these have been concentrated certainly by the big commercial rental companies in city centres, e-bikes and e-scooters, whereas actually I suspect they have more application in suburbs, particularly e-bikes. E-bikes have gone absolutely mega in countries like Germany. More e-bikes have been sold recently in Germany than pedal cycles, for example. And e-bikes, I think, have particular potential utility in outer suburbs because they allow for this web of relatively short journeys, a kind of trip chaining that you can get in outer suburbs, but where the distances are a bit annoying or too long to walk. I think the economics of some of this stuff is quite challenging because of the density of trips. So I think in the outer suburbs you could almost do with more of these different kind of light mobility options alongside public transport, rental and privately owned, but the economics don't really stack up so well. So this is where there needs some kind of support from the state, local state, whatever it may be. So how do you do that? Mobility hubs, that's one of the big ideas at the moment. If you go to Berlin, for example, they're planning to introduce mobility hubs right across the city and its suburbs. I think it's interesting that they're doing it everywhere, not just the city centre. It's all under the Yelby brand. So Yelby is an app on your phone which allows information and payment for public transport and just about all the car, van hire, e-bike hire, e-scooter hire, moped hire services. So it allows you to pay for that. It doesn't cap it. It's not a cap system, but allows you to pay. And so you'll have a Yelby app and also these mobility hubs everywhere where you can pick up your e-bike and e-scooters and the larger ones, car hire, at your public transport stops. So that'll be a really interesting experiment, I think. What is the results of that? Personally, I think we need something of that scale to know whether this is a fad or it is part of the solution. There are real challenges, particularly around the economics of this stuff. I suspect that what you also get is wealthier private households will become their own mobility hubs. So they'll have their cars, they'll have their scooter e-bikes, they'll have their bikes. They'll be their own private mobility hub, and the public mobility hubs can supplement that. Obviously, of course, not everyone is going to be able to afford to have their own private mobility hub.
I've often thought that maybe the idea of going towards the economic places or having the hub at the station maybe isn't the right place. It might be, for instance, at the hospital or the schools. So you mentioned before about in Britain that it's about the engineers, the finance team, and others who are working around the table to decide these decisions. It's exactly the same here. So it's not about what's the vision we have for the community. It's very much about the benefit cost ratio. Often they'll fudge that just to get it up across the line. So how do we start to even bring in a conversation which is less number crunched? The other question I wanted to ask is, for the outer suburbs, what I wondered is whether there is a different metric that's required. So you talked about the economic, how do you get that to work for the Yelby app? Are there different metrics that are required for the outer suburbs and the suburbs that aren't required when you're talking about the commute and the CBD?
I think somehow it has to be publicly supported because I guess there's cost benefit analysis, as you say, but there's just the sheer income and the commercial aspects. If you're saying the private sector is going to run all these rental schemes. So I think somehow you need to publicly support that. And it's not easy as well because then you need the local authority resource to make the decisions around how these schemes are managed and operated. So it is a real challenge, but I think the starting point is recognising that it's unlikely the private sector is going to solve this by itself because it's not commercial for them. So that's one starting point. You were talking earlier about hospitals and shopping centres and what have you. And I do think there's a role for them as what they've become known as anchor institutions. The idea that you've got large suburban employers, they've got a public service remit, and often that will include things about sustainability and inclusion. So they can be really good starting points for some of the stuff we've talked about. It's not been as easy as it might appear in Britain, certainly. The health service, for example, the only form of transport they're really interested in is helicopters. And people don't join the National Health Service to sort out transport logistics. So they tend to be put them in the wrong place in the centre of massive car parks. But nevertheless, in principle, you've got schools, you've got local government, you've got the healthcare sector. And starting there, I think, is a very good place to start because they should have these shared objectives. And there are places and case studies of some of these institutions in the UK, particularly around things like car share, where they've really got stuck into it. So I think that's part of it. I think engagements, one of the things on the travels, I mean, I always thought of consultation as a kind of very formal exercise, public meetings and questionnaires and what have you. But again, going to some of these next level cities, they're doing some really interesting things. I was in Ljubljana, Slovenia, and did a presentation there. And it was about the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan, which is the kind of jargon in the EU for a long-term transport plan. Anyway, they had the normal public meeting in this housing area, and I think one person turned up. And so they thought, why don't we just go and talk to people? So they just went out there and they actually got these pictures of these people with very basic, like card and paper put on top, and they had them on their backs so people could write onto these sheets on the back of these people walking around. They got a really good response because people did have views about transport. They just weren't going to go to a boring public meeting about it. Or in Belgium, where they had an experience around low traffic neighbourhoods in Brussels, where the consultation went fine. As soon as they did it, everything exploded and everyone said they hated it. So they thought it's not something's wrong here. Instead of doing the normal consultation next time around, they did a street event with free pancakes and games for children and what have you, and started where people were at, both physically in their street, but also not going to them with, here's what we want to do, but what are your problems and how can we sort this out? What seems to be happening in some of the more forward-thinking places is just a fresher and looser approach to consultation. A lot of us will sit around the legal requirements on consultation and the conventional stuff, but I think people are getting much looser and more adventurous in how they engage with communities. And I think that's also part of the way forward.
So, what I notice with our both state agency and also our local council here is there's a lot of reluctance to make a decision, stick your head above the parapet. A lot of nervousness about doing something different, doing it that it's not in the guidance. There's also this question of we can't use the money, we don't have the resources. They seem to have lots of money to do things that make, to me, in my mind, not much sense at all. And there is always a way of making money work better if you think about it. Building lots of roads, for instance, is obviously extremely expensive. Maintaining roads is extremely expensive. So I would have thought a really good way to shift your spend is to think, how can we spend less on roads? To me, that's like first thing. But there is a lot of reluctance to think how can I do this differently? Because I will be given grief by the residents, by further up the food chain, by anyone and everyone.
Yes, and you can kind of see that in a way. One part of it is the political leadership, isn't it? And if you've got someone who gives a strong lead and has a political mandate, but you don't get that all that often in practice. When I was in local government, it was indirectly because we were the representative body for the organisations, but the risk aversion I found quite hard to get my head around. I would go to people and say, "Oh, you're doing this positive thing. I want to tell the world about it." And they were very reluctant because in their heads, I think they were thinking, will I be seen as trying to be too pushy? Or is there a 2% chance that somehow it could look bad for me? And I would always think, you only live once, including your professional life. So why? What's the problem? So, yeah, I think there is this cultural thing. But then again, in the most forward thinking cities, they're in a different kind of spiral. And it's really interesting to meet people who are relatively young who are doing big things and don't seem to have this all consuming fear and conservatism that you get. So I guess in some ways we're back to that cultural change, and are there places within the system where at least you can start to change your mindset? We've talked about a few, like the engagement. Is there some areas where you can just start to infiltrate a different kind of approach on the basis of what some more forward-thinking cities are doing? And I totally agree with you as well. I was involved in a big anti-roads fight in the UK, and we still, they never die, these schemes. They're like zombies. Even when there's not really much point, they're always in someone's drawer and they can always come back. As you say, the costs are ridiculous. So, for example, there's so many different things we want streets to do, and that's a challenge juggling them. But one of it is climate resilience, and it's just starting to come in at the edges in the UK around sustainable urban drainage schemes. But it's obviously clear to everyone that we're going to need more of this stuff, and the cost of doing it. We've got Lower Thames Crossing, a new road scheme, £10 billion. You could do 130 schemes the size of the largest sustainable urban drainage scheme we've got in the UK, which is a reasonably large town called Mansfield. But we won't do that. We'll spend it on a new road, and then we'll spend another massive amount with the flooding impacts that will result. I think some of this climate resilience stuff can press different buttons. So, for example, talked about in Berlin, they've just passed this law to do 1 million street trees. In the Netherlands, they have this great thing. It's a tile flipping contest. So every year, municipalities compete to who can work with their communities to get rid of the most paving tiles in front and back gardens. And it gets rid of millions. It gets people going. And what's not to like? So sometimes going around some of the set piece carving, non-car stuff can help change the culture, but also do things we need to do.
So we're just at the point in the conversation where I ask, okay, so my friend, she's got a couple of small kids, no time, no money, very little capacity. Life is really busy when you're a mum with little kids. So she doesn't have a lot of time to be ringing up the council every 4 minutes going, please, could you do this? So, what's something that she could do that you think would be really helpful to get your ideas across the line?
I think it's probably about picking one issue out that interests and excites them. I do think there's scope for more of this tile flipping. So it may be picking out something that is of interest to them, which is a new idea, which could have impact beyond whatever this person might do just themselves, and perhaps coming at it from a slightly different angle. It's always good, if you haven't got much time, to throw yourself in with some existing wider campaign and see what you can contribute to that, because it's always easier to work with others rather than just try and do things entirely by yourself.
Say someone's at council, they're junior in either the transport or the planning team. What's something that they can do to help shift the conversation, get some change?
I do think, in general, what I would say to people in local government is just take a breath. What is it you're trying to achieve? What are other places doing which could be applicable? And think about it. Don't just do what you've always done or chase whatever is the fashionable, shiny thing in policy that everyone else is doing. And also, how can maybe just infiltrate some of this approach that you get from these next level cities, less compartmentalized around doing this one thing will achieve this exact numeric outcome, and think about how it can contribute to civic life, to that civic imperative, and how it can help build towards something, be one step on the road to something big, trying to get into this virtuous spiral and provide some kind of inspiration and some kind of difference. But they're probably best placed to determine what that might be, because I think what I try to do in this report is not to do what most reports do, which is here's just cut and paste these 10-point solutions. What I try to do is say, this is difficult, you need to think about it. Here's some frames for thinking about it. And here are some examples which may or may not be something you could take from.
Yeah, that's really good. So just before we wrap up, is there anything else you would like to add? Anything you wish I had asked that I just didn't think of? What else would you like to share?
Well, I've enjoyed the conversation. It's been good that we have focused in on some of these things around thinking and cultures of governance, because I think that's a really good place to start from rather than the outputs on the ground. And I think it's really good that you're doing thinking around outer suburbs, because, as we discussed, there's not enough out there, and the way people think about suburbs can be a bit simplistic. So I think you're doing some great work, and it's really valuable work, I'm sure, in your area, but more widely too.
Oh, it's a very generous, lovely thing to end with. Thank you very much, Jonathan. I very much appreciate that. Yeah, it's been a great conversation, and it just shows it's just tough. It doesn't matter what you do, it's going to be difficult. It really requires a very fresh, different way of thinking about it, and that's not easy for everyone.
Yeah, just got to keep going. Optimism of the spirit.
I always think the only way is up. That's my way of thinking about it. All right, thanks so much.
Thank you.
That's Streets and People. Thanks for listening. You can find more at getaroundcaboolture.au. We'd love your ideas. If there's a speaker you'd like us to interview or a topic you'd like us to explore, please let us know through the contact box on our website.